All right, hello and good evening, everybody. I'm speaking today to Dr. John Enders, who is working at the Institute of Race Relations, and he wrote an article on Roman Cabanac. And for those who would recall, it was actually the IRR, one of the members there, Gabriel Cruz, who criticized Roman for comments he made some time ago, right, within his rights, and that sort of triggered the media event. And yeah, so John, I'd just like to get your the side of the IRR's your IRR side of the story, and then we take it from there.
Mm. I think from our perspective, so there's a lot of respect, I think, for Roman as well amongst the
Mm,
colleagues. And that is something I try to bring out in the article which I wrote myself on the Daily Friend, pointing out that there's a strong case, I think, to be made to introduce an element of unconventionality and out-of-the-box thinking into government structures, as well as people from outside the party. So in other words, if you just bring in your own party colleagues all the time, you're going to form echo chambers and sort of get a reinforcement of whatever the current narrative is. And I thought in this sense that Steenhuisen's choice of Cabanac was actually quite inspired because it was out of left field, unconventional, quite unusual, etc. That having been said, there were some statements of Ramon's that, from a classically liberal perspective, are to be seen quite critically. And those are the ones that Gabriel picked up on. So he pointed out some comments of Ramon's, I think, about blacks not being able to be liberal, blacks can't be liberal or aren't liberal. And that as a result of this, a party like the DA, which claims for itself to be a liberal party, could never be led by a black person. And this is a sort of race essentialist type of thinking that we oppose at the IR. We're trying to move South Africa, the entire country, away from this kind of thinking, where people think, the left-wing commentators will say, why hasn't the DA got a black leader? It can never be successful if it hasn't got a black leader. It needs to have a black leader. That's race essentialist thinking. And Ramon was making the same argument from the other side, saying, as long as there's a white leader in place, blacks won't vote for it. That's what we want to argue against, and make the case for non-racialism in South Africa as strongly as we possibly can. So that's the big picture.
right. So and that seemed reasonable to me. I know Gabriel was criticized a lot, but I thought the comments there was reasonable. What I thought was a bit unreasonable. Now, as a disclaimer, I also know Roman. I was in Russia with him. I'm one of the Russians, if you will, that went with him. And I know you wrote in the article you also know him. So we both know him. Very likable guy. He has views that I disagree with.
Mm.
I do find him a little bit provocative at times, and I do think and get your view on this, what really irritates a lot of journalists, and I know editors of controversial newspapers like IOL, for example, because I write for them from time to time, and I don't definitely agree with all of they're doing, but you always maintain a relationship when you're in the media with the editor. And my
Mm.
number one rule is I never pick fights with any editor. I might pick fights
Mm.
with the people writing the economists, but the editors I respect. And I
Mm.
think one mistake that they do make is that they try and be too provocative to everybody in the media, and inevitably
Mm.
that creates enemies for you, right? When you get into a position of authority.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And this was one of the observations about Ramon. I think he's been very liberal at sort of dealing out the punishment from his perspective, and I think he did make a lot of enemies. Was I think I wrote in my article as well. I met somebody who was a senior person at another think tank in South Africa, who, as we were waiting for a meeting to start, sort of unprovoked, said, "Oh, that Cabanac, what a terrible person! What was Steenhuisen thinking, etc., etc." And it turned out he had a personal interaction with him, I think, on social media. You can imagine what Roman must have thought about this person and written about this person. So he did not make a friend for life there. And when it came to the situation of him being appointed, then this was a person who was, I think, very happy to see people going after him. Another point to make here is that, as much as I endorse unconventional thinking, I also think that political parties and establishments are like oil super tankers. They've got a lot of momentum and inertia that just keeps traveling in the same direction. It's very hard for them to change direction quickly. And what Ramon was trying to do here, I think sincerely, is a very sudden change in direction of his own image, his own reputation, his own personality. So very much based as enfant terrible beforehand, trying to provoke all and sundry in South Africa. and then sort of stopping overnight and saying, okay, now I'm a respectable government spokesperson, no more provocations, etc., etc. And that is a hard act to pull off. And that is probably also why, in the end, Steenhuisen asked Roman to resign. I think it was just because that change in direction was too sudden, too swift to be able to pull off.
The other point I point out here is I am concerned about the due diligence in the DA. Now, you made the point it wasn't cadre deployment. I totally agree with that. He's competent. He's got the qualification. He grew up on a farm. He had his own businesses. So it's a conversational entrepreneur out of the box type of thinking guy. But I do question the principle that is it okay for a party leader just to appoint a chief of staff like that? I mean, or should he not, Steenhuisen not have consulted his own party before he made a decision and say, okay, maybe there's too much opposition before approaching Roman? That.
Yeah, I do think that ministers and people in positions of executive power should have a lot of leeway in who they appoint, because ultimately the buck stops with them. And this is a failing in the South African political system, where often the buck doesn't stop; it sort of just hangs around, walks about, and never gets taken out. The point I'm trying to make is that if Steenhuisen assembles a hand-picked team around him and does a great job, then why would you worry about it? If he assembles a hand-picked team and does a terrible job, he should get fired because he's not doing his job properly. But that responsibility should rest with him, and it should be the assessment of whether he should continue in his position should be based on his performance. And that is the only criterion that really matters: accountability and responsibility for your job.
So then a question that follows up from here is, Oman obviously it came after Ronaldo Ghost. Now, Ronaldo Ghost was way more black and white, excuse the pun, in terms of being dismissed. Okay, although it seems even his disciplinary process did not follow. There's some strange things happening, but you can understand. Okay, that video, the DA cannot take a risk of anything of the sort. So, I mean, to what extent do you think was this just a case that the DA was sort of also trying to close down all the possible fires? He was in a bit of an
Yes.
unfortunate position being the second person in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right about that. So it is a question of party positioning as well. And in case of doubt, I think they said, okay, let's just make a clear-cut choice. If there's something that's iffy, that's questionable, that's contentious, get it out of the way. Let's just focus on doing our jobs. And this is a distraction to what we're doing. And it's tying up valuable resources and defending a decision. And I think that with Hoos and also with Cabanac, the decision they made in the end was to say, okay, we're going to cut our losses. We're going to take some damage, out of the decisions we made and how we've handled the situation. But this is what we're going to do now. Let's move forward. So yeah, I think that does play a role.
And in terms of the damage that they've taken, I mean, they do represent a type of constituency. There's American they called alt-right. I don't think it entirely applies to them, but it's a sort of a provocative, often masculine type of position, which is saying, listen, we don't like the rules of the system, that they present. I mean, to what extent do you think this can do damage to the DA in the long run?
I don't think it will do much damage. So my sense is that most of the people who were upset about Roman's appointment were not, on the whole, black people. I don't think it was like an ANC voter, an EFF MK member of parliament looking at Roman is going to say, look, this is like a wild guy. Cool. Like the agriculture minister wants a wild guy on his team. That's fine. I don't think they've got a problem with that. I think the problem comes really from liberals. And now I use the term in the negative sense, where I choose not to include myself. But the kinds of people who get really upset about people not respecting the forms, about being impolite, about being provocative, and so on. So some people get very upset about that sort of thing, and then they'll say, when we get the chance to go after somebody like that, like Roman, we're going to take the opportunity. We want to shoot him down. We want to cancel him. And that's what happened there. And I think that is actually the constituency, the group that was the most upset by the appointment, is media people, basically journalists, liberals, maybe in the American sense, progressives. They were really worried about this.
Okay, well, then last question, and before we go, because it's a short podcast. Many of us are in the media. You are, people in the IRR. We all have public images. We know in today's world you need to put your message out there if you want to sell. You want to sell yourself in a certain sense. I'm also doing that in a way. And if ever we are approached to assist government, I mean, I attended the nuclear seminar. I haven't had an appointment, but I was somewhat involved to give some advice, even though briefly. If we were to ever go into positions of that sort, I mean, what precautions should we take? Because there's a stuff I wrote 10 years ago, which I don't think I agree with at the moment, but it's there, it's in the open.
So I think a really important argument to make there is the argument of in the mild formulation, the right to change your mind, which should be an uncontentious right. And in the stronger formulation, the right or recognition of the possibility of redemption. So in other words, do you believe that a person who's done something wrong can redeem themselves by distancing themselves from their wrong act and by behaving in a different way? Or do you not believe that? And I think a lot of what we're seeing with cancel culture coming out of sort of the progressive left wing in the United States and in other countries as well is that they do not believe that a person can change. They do not believe that a person can change their mind, their opinion, even when the facts change. And they do not believe in the possibility of redemption. And this is reflected in the saying by Jonathan Witt. He says, never apologize. And the reason why you should never apologize is because your opponents do not believe that you are capable or worthy of redemption. And so an apology does not help. It only inculpates you further. Yeah.
Yeah, the apology is in my way. It's very cult-like. It's sort of like you submit to authority as opposed to a genuine apology. Um, and as I say, you can find stuff I wrote. No, it wasn't to that extent, but where I contradicted what I would say today. Okay, because I always make the distinction when I judge characters in the media between what you would call truth-seeking behavior, people who change their minds when the facts change, and then refuge-seeking, those who just want to defend a position no matter untenable. And it's sort of that distinction I argue needs to go forward. To say, okay, this person has a behavior that is at least open to persuasion, where somebody else just wants to sell you a narrative, right?
Yeah. And I think what makes it even worse in a sense, Juho, is that um, some of the views that you hold today that are perfectly respectable and acceptable today will not be acceptable 15, 20, 30 years from now. And by that time, your views might have evolved along with society, but the record of what you used to believe those decades in the past will forever be written on social media. It's basically indelible. And this is the kind of culture we've got at the moment, is where you will be held accountable for that without the option of changing your mind or being redeemed.
I suppose I would like to see a societal change back again, is just to say, listen, this was 10, 20 years ago, let's wait a little bit. And we've seen signs of that, I think, now. But I mean, even Ronaldo goes to me. I remember a time, we were in school where people would use racial slurs at the end of apartheid as a joking way. And that was how barriers was broken down. Okay.
Yes,
If those conversations I had were to be recorded today, I mean, I'd lose my
yes,
job. Okay.
yes, and
And
exactly,
taboos change, right? Things of that nature.
yes, exactly. And in a sense, I think a lot of the cultural shift that has happened over the past maybe 15 or 20 years, or maybe even 10 years, under the impact of critical race theory, is that this is basically a machine for producing eggshells. Apologies for the interruption. I'm back. It's a machine for
You,
creating eggshells. Yeah. So what it does is that it imposes taboos on more and more forms of speech and forms of action until people self-censor to a sufficient extent that they become silent. That's what it does. And you can see people expressing this thought on social media or in the media as well. Oh, I mustn't think that. I mustn't say that. I have to be careful about what I say here. And I think that's not a good development for a society. It's actually better to have thoughts out in the open, even if they are contentious, unacceptable, provocative. So at least you can interact with them. I do hope that the pendulum of history will swing back, towards more free speech. In much of the Western world, that doesn't quite seem to be happening yet. So if you look at the UK, at Canada, for example, their free speech really seems to be quite strictly circumscribed, and increasingly so, including through criminal sanction for expressing opinions. And I think that's a terribly dangerous development for those societies.
I totally agree. Well, John Enders, thank you very much for this conversation. And everyone, please read the article I wrote on Roman Cabanac. It's very insightful. It presents their position, and to say, make up your own mind if you agree with it or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you.